Okay, brilliant. Well,
All right.
it's great. Yeah, thank you very much for doing this because I
Yep.
really appreciate it. Because I know you're obviously busy because you're a professor of anthropology and anatomy at Idaho State University. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And how long have you been doing that for?
20, almost 29 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Amazing.
20, just over 29 years. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'm a a current zoology student,
Great.
and my I've always had a fascination with the subject of Bigfoot since I was maybe like maybe a kid. I saw Nat Geo Geographic. I remember distinctly I've been about 7 or 8, and they did a recreation of the Patterson
Ah,
Gimlin film.
yep.
Were you involved in that one by any?
I think I was, but yeah, sort of in on the
Okay.
sidelines. I remember when they
Yeah.
filmed it and the horses reacted to the microphone boom. They were genuinely skittish.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Um, but I just have I've been fascinated since that point, and then through sort of researching it, I kind of came across your work and your book because I also like because I'm studying science. I found it to be the most sort of compelling collection of information because
Yeah,
there's a lot of information online and there's a lot of stuff that you don't know credibility of. But
right.
what stuck out most to me about your book was that, and it's still a point that I can't get myself away from, is that you have footprints that have a particular anatomy to them. They have a particular movement to them
Right.
that are found in in remote areas of the Pacific Northwest, but then they're found hundreds of kilometers away, and
Right.
they show variation in the ridges, but they're also like similar as any species would show kind of
Right.
similarity across. So
Right.
I don't know how did you get into studying the footprints? What was it that brought you to the footprints?
Well, that was the point of departure as far as my academic specialty, which is the study of the evolution of human bipedalism, and especially the foot. And of course, that was influenced either consciously or unconsciously by I think, by my youthful experience with and ongoing continuing interest in the question of the possible existence of another bipedal hominin. And
Mm.
so when I was brought up face to face with fresh tracks in the ground, I mean, that was what really set the hook. That was what pulled me in. And as you point out, those same thoughts quickly became central to my questioning. My research was, uh, is there justification for concluding that there is an inherently consistent, biomechanically appropriate anatomy expressed in these otherwise seemingly disparate and unassociated footprint finds that attests to something biological, a biological entity leaving this footprint record. And so that's how, that's what my my interest was focused in right off the bat. And that's where, I mean, I find that the stories are intriguing, and all the other lines of evidence, but the more physical, whether it's footprints, whether it's hair, whether it's dermatoglyphics, those are the things that I think lend themselves most to a real objective evaluation.
Yeah, and what, because for me, like, I find it interesting when people say there's like I'm also kind of the like, for me to 100% sort of, I have to see the thing in its flesh for me to like
Sure.
to kind of like almost know it's real. But
Hmm.
I think there's so much. What do you think the resistance is to the evidence that is like
Yeah.
very, I believe, to be very at least worthy of in further investigation?
Right, right. And that is exactly the argument that I have made. It's I've never tried to proselytize and attract converts to a belief or a conviction, but rather win over the idea that the mind of the investigator to the possibility that there could be, that this is a justified investigation. And I think, that did bother me for a long time, because I had a hard time thinking that my colleagues, my discipline, was so dogmatic and so entrenched that they wouldn't even consider. I mean, they would allow the peer pressure and the social stigma that had been attached to this topic to dissuade them. And there actually are a lot of people who harbor a lot of closet interest in the topic that I interact with behind the scenes. But what finally occurred to me, and this is so true with so many issues, you cannot consider the issue in isolation. You have to view it against the backdrop of the historical times. And back in the 50s and 60s, anthropology was grappling with a new idea that had been proposed. Some anthropologists, casting about for useful paradigms in other disciplines that could be incorporated and integrated into anthropology to make it a more rigorous, because anthropology always kind of struggled, especially social and cultural, with the idea of being, whether or not it justified being a hard science. It was kind of warm and fuzzy and soft edges and cuddly and so forth. And so one of those notions was the niche hypothesis, which had its origins back in microbiology, when Gauss posited that what was called the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species could occupy the same niche, in his case, he was looking at microbes, the same medium, the same habitat. One would outcompete the other. And so that became the central tenet of the niche concept. And so anthropologists looked at that and thought, well, the hominin niche, bipedalism, braininess, and above all culture, that's a pretty exclusive club. So there can only be one species at a time. This is why there was such a struggle early on to acknowledge that there were different species of Australopithecine. They kept trying to account for them as males and females, of a single species, because there could only be one species. And eventually that fell apart. It was clear there were not just two, but there were multiple Australopithecine species. And so the rationalization was, well, they're just bipedal chimps. They have brains barely bigger than a chimpanzee. So this competitive exclusion principle, wouldn't apply to them. So they kicked the can down the road. Well, no sooner had they done that than Richard Leakey is writing up the discoveries in East Africa. And what? He's got a Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Paranthropus boisei, all on the same platter at the same time frame. So they had to kick the can again even further and say, well, Homo sapiens, we've excluded everybody else. We're the last hominin standing. And I've got there's a book on my shelf by that very title, The Last Hominin Standing. And Nova did a special with that title, The Last Hominin Standing. And so now, though, we know that there's this bushy tree, and that's been well established, and the corollary of that is that there are numerous branches on that bushy tree that are now being acknowledged as having persisted until far more recently than would have even been conceived of 20 years ago. So you've got the hobbit, Homo floresiensis. For a while it was 13 to 18,000 years old. It's been kicked back a little bit, but still, the discoverers have acknowledged that, well, the local people have been telling us stories about these little hairy people that kind of fit the bill living up in the forests of the mountains all along. We've got Homo erectus in Java, possibly as young as 25,000 years. We've got Homo heidelbergensis in East Asia that's between 20 and 30,000 years. We've got the red deer people of southern China that are about 50,000, and we have Neanderthal sites that are possibly as young as 23,000. There was even one that was being batted about, an occupation site. They hadn't discovered any bones yet, but the tool cultures said Neanderthal, and it was only 10,000 years old was the preliminary finding. So in the face of that, pressing on the one side, and all these reports, anecdotes, and other trace and possible physical evidence, hair, whatever, pressing from the other side, why is it so difficult? Well, it's because that shadow of the single species hypothesis is still casting its influence forward, and and all the old guard, all the department chairs, the deans, the society presidents, the symposia chair people, they're all the gatekeepers are still the old guard. Now it's starting to change. I keep bumping into young anthropologists, fresh PhDs from many from strong traditional backgrounds who are closet enthusiasts, and they're going to have to sit on that enthusiasm for another 5 years until they get tenure, quite honestly, because that's just the way it works. You've got to be conservative, you've got to keep your shoulder to the wheel and eye on the ball until you get that coveted job security, and then that's when academic freedom really begins or can be expressed. But anyway, so I think that's why. I mean, in a long answer to a straightforward question, I really think it's that historical context, So when when you look at that, when Roger Patterson, well, let's go back even further, 1962, the first real kind of encyclopedic treatment. It's a popular book, but it's written by not a PhD academic, but a guy who, Ivan T. Sanderson, who was a bit of a maverick, admittedly, but nevertheless, he knew animals. He was a profound zoologist, and his book, Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, was published in 1962. And you look at the reviews, and they treat it like it was fantasy, like it was just this, because, the subtitle, Subhuman Species on 5 Continents. Well, that was just absurd. There was no accommodation for the possibility that thing could, premise rather, had any merit. Therefore, this must be science fiction. And then 1967, Roger Patterson brings his film to the experts first at UBC and then at the Smithsonian. And, what are they going to say? For them, such a thing could not exist. There could be only one species, and we were it already. The niche was filled, so it had to be hoaxed. So they looked for ways to justify their preconception that it was hoaxed. And as a result, you get these ridiculous, I mean, even in hindsight, they're just so absurd comments about, my favorite, and not to belabor the point, but my favorite was actually came from one of the more open-minded of the members of the panel, John Napier, a famous primatologist who had a lot of influence on the study of primate locomotion. He was a physician. He had a strong grounding in comparative anatomy and functional morphology, but yet when he looked at that film in his book, I mean, he was obviously impressed enough by the possibility of the topic in general that he spent his golden years before he passed away writing a book about Bigfoot, one of the first published books by a bona fide PhD. And when it came to the film, he basically said, there's only one thing I can put my finger on that I can't accept, that causes me to reject this. And basically it was, when I look at the figure on the film, from the waist up, she looks like an ape. But from the waist down, it's typically human proportions. He said it's inconceivable that such a hybrid of structure would exist in nature. Therefore, it must be contrived, basically, paraphrasing him. Well, isn't it interesting? Because just a few years later, that was published in the early 70s, 72, 73, about 75, 76 is when Johansen announces the discovery of Lucy. And for the first time, we really have a pelvis, we have knee joints, we have the things that show that this creature with a skull that's barely distinguishable from a chimpanzee was combined with a pelvis that was barely distinguishable from a human, except in some dramatic points. But the point is, how did they describe it to the popular press? from the waist up, she looks remarkably like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she looks like a little short-legged human. Well, isn't that interesting? That was the very linchpin of Napier's rejection of the whole thing. I wonder what if he had waited to publish his book. I'm not aware of any commentary or follow-up or qualification of his position. I think by that time he had was on his last leg on the way out. But there were other silly things like hair on the breasts, or yes, it has breasts, but it walks like a man. Well, of course it walks like a man. The only reason a human female walks like a female is the wide pelvis to allow for a birth canal. If that constraint's not there, then the male and female Sasquatch pelvis is basically the same and looks much more like a human male than it would a human female. And so, I mean, just you go down the list of the things that were said, and it's like, give me a break. And yet those get repeated, and the position, the blanket rejection by the experts gets repeated and reiterated without any evaluation, without any analysis of what they actually said. Anyway, I'm rambling on, so I'll
No, it's great. That's great. I want to focus it, because I 100% agree with what you're saying about. In fact, it's almost blasphemy for me as a science student to be doing this interview. But I've always gone on about it since I was younger, and I know there's many people who will see this and they'll probably say, they just say, oh, you're still going on about Bigfoot, whatever. But I want to go through some of the kind of like what I consider to be the sort of what I consider to be the best evidence, and I want to get your opinion on it. And I want to talk through some of the things that people say to me when they tell me about like why it's couldn't be real, why what's the reasoning behind it. And so the first major one is I'm going to talk about the Patterson-Gimlin film, because for me it's like still just in terms of like its quality of what it shows, it's still to me like one of the best. I think there's a few new ones actually I've seen, but one of the best. And so when I'm generally what I do when I show people the Planet of the Apes costumes that were available at the time. And I say to them, this was the height of Hollywood creativity at the time. This was the best costumes that they could come up with. And it's so blatantly obvious that this costume is fake, like that it looks so bad.
Right.
And then you see this creature and you see the muscle definition, you see the like different shades of the coat, you see that it's walking through the woods in a way that is not remote. I wouldn't say is even remotely possible for someone who is in a suit.
Right.
But from an anatomy perspective, what is it that you see in the Patterson-Gimlin film that is so compelling that this is a real biological living species?
Well, yeah, and you hit on a number of generalized points that we could literally dissect, and I have in some of my presentations where we literally go from the head down to the toes and point for point just show every detail of anatomy. Let me go back to again my area of expertise, which is the footprints, and make the statement that if all I had in relationship to that event were the footprints as documented at the site, that would have been sufficient for me to convince me that was a real event, not a hoax, not a contrivance, because the correlation of the anatomy, which has formed in my mind the basis of a diagnostic description, an ichnotaxon. I've actually taken the step of, and somewhat controversial admittedly, but nevertheless with lots and lots of backing and support by colleagues in that discipline, of erecting a taxon describing the footprints, and the type specimens and the holotype are consists of the footprints from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And central to that differential diagnosis is the presence of a mid-tarsal break, a primitive characteristic that reflects a much greater range of flexibility through the transverse tarsal joint. So they have never evolved an arch. They have a flat, flexible foot, which is, and this is what's interesting, is when I was proposing this, it still was the mantra was, and again, it kind of also harks back to this notion of the exclusivity of the human family, that the first hominins were walking on little human feet, little human-like feet with arches. The Laetoli tracks had been misinterpreted time and time again as having been left by little human-like feet, walking essentially like we do. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, they walk more like we do than a lion walks like we do. But as far as making that statement, that conclusion, it's unjustified. My point simply being is my description of the Sasquatch footprint refreshed my consideration of the evidence for the earliest hominins, because I was quite interested. Was that a characteristic that distinguished us from them as far as a shared common ancestor? Did the Sasquatch lineage diverge prior to the emergence of the human longitudinal arch? And and it did, because the conclusion that I reached was that longitudinal arch didn't emerge until probably Homo heidelbergensis, because Neanderthals have an arch, we have an arch, much more pronounced than even Neanderthal, which I think was only facilitated by the reduction of our musculoskeletal robusticity. But anyway, the point being, is that mid-tarsal break, that flat, flexible foot, is very pivotal. Now it's acknowledged that early hominins, for well over 2 million years, at least, well, depending on when bipedalism emerged, if it was as early as 7 million years, as some have posited, then it could have been all the way up, until 2.5 million years ago, before the longitudinal arch emerged. So for all that time, early hominins were walking on flat, flexible feet with a non-divergent big toe, which is essentially the strategy of Sasquatch. I mean, it's the strategy pretty much of most other possible bipedal hominins. I mean, since bipedalism has been recognized as popping its head up every now and again in unexpected places amongst Miocene apes. Like Danuvius was the most recent one that's been posited. Oreopithecus has been suggested, although anyway, but neither here nor there at this point. So if you just then go on up from the feet upward, I mean, there are so many things. I alluded to the interesting observation of Napier and the apparent unexpected mosaic of characters. In one of my talks, I go through a whole list of unexpected mosaics, from a flat face with a massive jaws and hypertrophied teeth, the opposite of what has been posited for humans, with the flattening of the face combined with the reduction of the dentition, and just down the list of other things that have anticipated by decades what now is conventional wisdom in anthropology for characteristics, the emergence of characteristics and correlated combinations in hominin evolution. At the time that they were supposedly incorporated in this hoax, they went actually, counter. First of all, Roger Patterson could never have come up with the remarkably subtly correlated anatomy if he had a coach on the sidelines. The coach was giving him advice that was absolutely counterintuitive based on the then conventional wisdom, contradicted all the preconceptions. And so that's kind of the approach that I take to the film. I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating how now, after 50 years, it stands up. I mean, it's like the science has finally caught up with the film after
Mm.
50 years. And yet still, there are people who it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have.
Yeah, I think it's also like that. It's such, if you know, if you're faced with that kind of conclusion, I think it's threatening to everyone, because we have a kind of pre-existing viewpoint of the world. As you say, sometimes people have a very human-centered viewpoint of evolution. We like to think that evolution has all come together to form the beautiful human being,
Exactly.
rather than evolution being a process that goes in many different directions.
Yeah.
And it certainly would take us down a notch if we realize that there was another bipedal ape roaming around.
Yeah, yeah.
But
In some
uh,
people's mind, yeah.
and I want to just focus on another thing that I haven't heard your opinion about, and I'd love to hear about, is um I think it's Ron Moorhead. I think it's the Sequoia sounds he does.
Yeah.
I've listened to that a few times, and I find it to be the most. I get hairs on the back of my neck when I listen to it, because I just hear what to me sounds like, he's in. I believe he's in Sierra. He's in the Sierra. Is
Yeah.
he in Northern California?
Right. See, well, just below Lake Tahoe, so sort of central California.
And he hears, like, he's recording this sound, this, like, what sounds to me like a conversation between an adult and a sort of infant, and it's just the most bizarre, like, ape sounding thing I've heard, and I just don't know why. I think it's so similar to almost like so similar, because of, obviously, we'd have similar capabilities, but it's so different as well.
Right.
What do you think about that? Like, what is your opinion on that recording, and what does it mean?
I've always been extremely fascinated by it. I had a very early exposure to it. I happened when I was a youngster, just after having witnessed the film and so forth, and very deeply obsessed with this whole topic. I happened to be in a used bookstore, and there was a science analog magazine, and in the back was a little advertisement for the Sierra Sounds. And so I actually ordered, I got a 45 vinyl record, which I still have of those recordings. And I was amazed by them. The only thing, I mean, two things have put me off of, well, three things. Three things give me pause. One is Ron's now more recent revelation of paranormal events, presumably associated with these recordings and subsequent experiences, orbs of light, etc., and his fascination with a totally misapplied notion of quantum physics to the macro world. So that's one thing that gives me pain. The second one is Scott Nelson, his cryptolinguist colleague, who has unfortunately, in my opinion, overinterpreted the recordings, but yet is unwilling, despite my persistent advocating for it, he's unwilling to present his findings for peer review. I edit an online journal, so I can provide with an editorial board, not me solely, but a legitimate peer-reviewed journal that would provide a very sympathetic but very objective venue for his research and cultivate a dialogue with reviewers and commentators with expertise similar to his, and he won't do it. He won't submit it to that. So that gives me further pause. I totally disagree that what he's hearing as language is really phonemes and homonyms with human words. I think he hears, and see that here was the tipping point for me. I mean, because here locally, even, the Native Americans say that they speak Shoshone, for example. They can talk to each other they don't really talk. They mind speak, but that the Sasquatch can understand Shoshone. Well,
Okay.
and can speak it. Well, then Scott mentioned that he had sent the recordings to a colleague of his, a cryptolinguist, fellow cryptolinguist, who was Japanese. And this cryptolinguist could hear Japanese words.
Yeah.
Well, see,
Okay.
that's the penny drops. You hear
Yeah.
what you expect to hear, what you're familiar
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
And so the Shoshone hears, when he hears amongst this gibberish, apish chitter chatter, jibber jabber, he hears some Shoshone syllables or phrases.
Mhm.
Whereas, but Ron, when he transcribes these long dialogues, and anyway, so that's one. The third one, and the most damning in a way, because those others, the bare data could be real. It's just the interpretation veneer
Yeah. Of course.
is
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
wrong, is erroneous. But the last one is more problematic, and that is all of the footprints that they have documented are not anatomical. They're not natural looking. They look contrived.
Okay.
You can't tell
Okay.
a right from a left. They look like these wedge-shaped swim fins with sausage toes across the end. And Ron has provided me, because I pressed him on this issue in some of the published illustrations. I said, are these unusual or exceptional, or is this the norm? And he sent me a whole slug of photos of that they of their documented footprints, and they're all the same. So
Yeah.
whether
Okay.
someone's, I mean, it's hard to imagine someone hoaxing them in that remote
Yeah.
location under those conditions, because they're fresh tracks in snow, a lot of them. The alternate is even more troubling, though, that if someone's not hoaxing them, then they're fabricating the footprints.
Mhm.
So that's, I hate to point a finger, but my judgment remains reserved on that whole thing.
Yeah. Of course. Of course. Like I think that just on on the recording itself, I saw this. And I don't know if this is true. I've always kind of been. This is where my doubt has the vocal range of what's being recorded. Is it outside the human vocal range, or is it
Right.
within the capacity of the human vocal range?
Right. And my understanding is, based on some of the studies that have been done, what was done, was it Krillin or Kierlin was a bioacoustician that did some papers on it, and he seemed to show, when you looked at the vocal repertoire, the frequency and range, that there were some things that seemed to be outside of human range, or there were things that were consistently absent. Like the most common vowel sound of E is almost entirely absent, which would be
Yeah.
extremely difficult for someone without a lot of training and practice to spontaneously generate a sound, a litany of exchanges, and not ever emit, for example, an E vowel
Yeah.
sound.
Yeah.
So there's some things like that. There were also, the notion that the vocal tract was excessively large based on some of the parameters of the recorded voice. And the telling moment was when I think it was John Green said, well, couldn't you recreate that simply by talking into a tube, or and artificially extending the vocal tract? And the guy said, well, yes, that's true. So someone with a vacuum hose or a piece of pipe, or an elk bugle could
Yeah.
conceivably generate that particular feature. So there are all those things that are equivocal. And then that, combined with the three that I mentioned, just really give me pause. So I
Yeah.
certainly cannot wholeheartedly endorse. I think it's interesting and deserves continued consideration. I know Ron, and
Yeah.
I interact with him repeatedly, and we've always been on a good basis, and I've always been reluctant to point these things out in public in his presence, but um, I think that he's sincere. He's just misguided
Hmm.
in some aspects, like the quantum physics, for example, and is what
Yeah.
it
Well,
is.
it could be a factor. Someone might have an experience, maybe they have a real experience, and
Right.
then post that real experience, they can't, their methods or whatever, they don't get the experience that they want, and then they sort of try to
Yep.
they might try to, and I think you're better looking at, to me, what's compelling about it is, first of all, the sound of it. The sound of it doesn't sound, if you're going to fake something like that, that is so there's a couple of things with with Sasquatch in general that I just
Yeah.
find to be, that I come back to, and I say, if it's if you're faking this, it's one of the most amazing hoaxes in the history of humanity, because of the kind of consistency
Right.
throughout, of what is being fabricated. It's
Right.
almost, it would be, it's the most incredible unorganized hoax,
Yep.
and
Yep.
there's a kind of element to that the vocalization that you hear in that it sounds so primordial and sort of ape-like, that
Yes.
it doesn't sound like what humans would even be able to fake do. You know what I mean? It's just
Right.
but to me, that's what I hear in it, and that's why it was so compelling to me.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I agree with you
yeah,
on that point, and that's what keeps me, that's what prevents me from just outright saying, "Oh, no, it's there's too much going against it.
yeah,
It's got to be fake," because there still is that impression that of spontaneity and
yeah,
having been around and watched many, many documentaries on top of personal firsthand experience with great apes and their vocalizations, chimpanzees and gibbons and spider monkeys, and there is that familiar ring that this is a real voice of a non-human primate.
yeah, and especially that look, like, I know you were saying about the tube, because but that would create a certain kind of echo that
Yeah.
I think
Yep. No, there would be
would
other compounding
there would
factors.
be other things that would happen. But to me, what is so interesting is you're talking about apes, and when you see, like, gibbons, or you see chimps even as well, and they have that, like, spherical kind of mouth shape, and their the sort of lower half of their mouth is almost fills with kind of air, and they can get that really low sort
Hmm.
of guttural sound that humans don't really use, or they don't really like,
Right.
they don't really have the capacity to do it on that level. And you hear that, that's why I get so almost freaked. I get like, I think that's why I have that reaction to it, is because feels so it feels genuine to me. It does
Yeah.
just, I don't get that feeling of, this is someone trying to do an
Right.
ape voice.
Yeah.
But
Oh, I agree.
if it's that could just be my, if it's incorrect, if it is fabricated, then that's fine. Because
Well,
I
and
still, yeah,
yeah,
I
and
still
another
think there's
factor
more.
to take into account, but you always you don't you never want to think that you're out thinking the hoaxers, uh,
Hmm.
but is the fact that if they're capable of generating, it's just like with the Patterson Gimlin film, if someone is capable of generating that quality, why only a one-off? And
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
in the
that's so
case
true.
of the Sierra sounds,
Yeah,
it's almost as if, and there seems to be sort of a historical narrative too, that there was a change in the social dynamic of that group that they were interacting with, and that it
hmm,
may have been this dominant male that was particularly inclined to tolerate the presence of and or interact with Ron and his companions there, and once he seemed to be gone, then it fell apart, and there hasn't been the kinds of recordings where we could use much more sophisticated recording equipment and everything, and now it's devolved into the occasional orb or something, or
yeah, yeah,
paranormal experiences to liven up the setting, but never again what happened back there in the 70s,
yeah,
or
yeah,
or late, yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting aspect too, and you have to weigh that, but in the end, I always kind of feel obligated to come back to the data, and what are the
yeah,
data, and as you point out, the data does have some interesting bearing, and so
yeah.
I
Let's
think
talk. Let's talk about the. Let's talk about the. I do want to talk about the footprints, but I want to talk about just a few other
sure.
things before that. About one thing is, people always say, especially when I say to you, they go, oh, well, like, why hasn't it been filmed more often? Why hasn't, there been a body or whatever? And I know, I also know that what people say about why there isn't a body, why there isn't a film. I
Right.
personally think that I don't know if you've seen it. There's a film of, I think it's either Oklahoma or something, and it's some guy walks into a sort of swamp area, and there's what appears to be a Sasquatch pulling
Yeah.
wood off of a tree, and then it
Right.
stands upright.
Yeah.
And it's in a swamp, like it's in, like, I don't know if there's alligators or whatever is in there, and
Yeah.
this guy
Cypress
is
swamp.
terrified, and he runs away. Like, and I don't know why that sort of stuff doesn't seem to filter into like people's view. I don't know how it escapes.
Yeah. Well,
Analysis.
it makes the rounds on YouTube and such, but in fact, when I was involved with a documentary series, or I was just an interviewee, but they were obviously taking advantage of the opportunity to try to pick my brain for as much insight as they could get, and they were wanting to know what were interesting films out there worthy of taking a closer look, because they kept coming back to me with just these really real stinkers, clunkers, that were like, why do you even bother? I mean, I don't even want to sully my reputation by giving the impression that I took this at all seriously. But that was one I kept pushing, and because I really wanted to have more in-depth analysis done and more understanding of the background. And apparently that's called the High Cliff video. And High Cliff, the fellow, the videographer, apparently he recognizes that he's got something that's interesting, and thinks that it commands a big licensing fee, far more than anyone was willing to provide. And so he just sits on it. And so that, unfortunately, that brought it to a screeching halt. But there have been some interesting breakdowns. I think Thinker Thunker does some interesting work now and again. And on that one, just the simple fact that if you look at the average size, because most people have no idea of the scale of cypress trees in that kind of a setting. And so to see some images, as Thinker Thunker provides, of typical humans against typical cypress trees, of even allowing for some range in size, it still suggests something that's massive. And it's just, I was impressed too when the thing stands up. First it's like a gorilla squatting.
Exactly.
Really, and then all of a sudden it stands up with these long legs. And
and it's also in the thing I don't get is, like, if you're going to hoax something like that, why hoax it in such an absolutely ridiculously dangerous situation? Like, if there's other animals around, and it just, this, again, I go off the basis of, if someone can give me a good explanation to why that event would occur naturally without a Sasquatch, it's like, what on earth? Like, what on earth is doing that? If it's a hoax, I'm fine with that. But please give me a valid explanation to what could possibly be doing that. And I know you did. I know Todd Standing has some kind of, it's a very kind of skeptical character, or he's his people think, oh no, he's completely faking or whatever. But there is one thing I'm not sure about, that one in the tree, but I'm very kind of iffy about that one. It looks a bit strange to me. But there was one photo of, like, an individual lying under a branch, lying down or something, and it looked just like an unbelievable photo if it is real.
Right.
And I don't know if it, again.
Well, and it's interesting that you the way you point that out, because our thought processes were similar in that regard. I had seen, when invited to come up to visit Todd and go out to one of his study locations, I was aware of the more controversial facial shots and had serious reservations about them, although I thought some of the analyses that had been done to try to poke holes in them were kind of poorly executed. They weren't very insightful. But while I was up there visiting him, he first unveiled and showed me a brief glimpse, albeit just a single showing of that image of this dark face, the one he calls the devil, underneath because of its jet black face.
Yeah.
But I was taken aback by what seemed to be a receding brow and the darkness of the face and the broad squash nose with a scar across it and the deep jaws and right down to, you could see the folds of skin around the eyes and little blemishes, little moles and so forth. And so that made me sit up in my seat and I go, now this was more, unlike the previous, this was more what I might expect a close-up of a Sasquatch to look like. The other two were totally unexpected, but I didn't want to reject them because they didn't appear like I expected they should appear. I wanted it to be on the basis of other things. I think, something more damning is the height of the philtrum, the distance from the nose to the upper lip, and which is pretty clear cut, human-like in the other two faces. So I don't know. I mean, when it comes to Todd, quite honestly, now that has become one of the most frequently asked questions. What do you think about Todd standing? And again, in my case, I have real serious reservations. I have some serious misgivings. I think he's his worst enemy, his own worst enemy, because of his approach and the way he tries to, the way he constantly name drops and he constantly, appeal to authority, very poor logical arguments, illogical arguments. And as a result, his stuff doesn't get the full airing because all people have to work are just little snippets of his data. And so
it's very hard to find that photo, like that photo online. I can't find it.
Oh, right. No, I think it's only I don't know. That's interesting. Why? I mean, it was featured in one of the documentaries, and I don't think that I think he's probably kept a pretty tight lid on that, trying to have some exclusivity of public showings in commercial venues. So it hasn't really made the rounds. But my admonition is to others is just, the dust will settle, the chips will fall, and don't have a don't get your knickers in a knot over something that we can't resolve at this point. So,
and why do you think we haven't got like that kind of definitive modern day video of a Sasquatch? Why do you think it's still kind of eluding? Right. It's still poor quality, or it's still kind of grainy or ambiguous,
Right. Well, I think if you take a step back and consider that all almost without exception, all of the credible visual encounters happen by chance. There are very few that are intentional, and those who claim to have repeated intentional interactions are very, very suspicious, very suspect. So the only times that videos are gotten are one of two things. They're either photo bombs, where someone's taking a picture of someone or something else, and a Sasquatch gets up and walks out of the frame in the backdrop. So they're always way off in the distance or something. They're just a silhouette against the illuminated background. And the other occasion is just that serendipitous encounter, and where the person is fumbling with the camera or whatever. And it isn't surprising to me that under those very rare and often very brief encounters, that when someone meets up with something so life-changing in many instances, so overwhelmingly impactful, that they don't have the presence of mind especially, I mean, someone of my generation, I have the hardest time getting my iPhone out and turning on the
Yeah, yeah,
camera. I'm always
yeah.
amazed that young people can do it so quickly. And yet, even in those circumstances, I think that they might not have the composure
Of course, of course. I
to
mean, you
do
would
it.
be very flustered if a 8 foot
Yeah,
bipedal ape that's supposed to not be real shows up
yeah,
in your field of vision, and you have to try to be calm and film it.
that's right.
But
Yeah,
have you ever had an experience yourself, like a physical, like a visual experience?
the closest thing to one came during that visit to Alberta, Canada, with Paul Freeman. I'm sorry, with Todd Standing.
Yeah,
And as a result, by association, I'm always kind of hesitant to even bring
yeah,
it
of
up
course.
sometimes because of that stigma. Like I said, that's become one of the most frequent questions people ask of me is, what do I think of Todd? So under the circumstances, I don't see how this could have been hoaxed. It was a very
Yeah,
brief, fleeting encounter. In his documentary, the most recent documentary, he does um, uh, explain it and lay it out quite well and quite accurately. But in any case, it was, excuse me, it was just a fleeting glimpse of a silhouette um, down across a dry creek bed. We were camped up against a berm blocking the road. The road then went down through this creek bed and up the other side. And something had approached camp. Something had vocalized. Something was breaking branches. Something sounded like a bull moose in size, and was circling our camp and our campfire. In the wee hours of the morning, we would routinely stay up late, in hopes that our activities, and we'd throw a strip of bacon on the fire, and so the smell would waft off. And so this was like the fifth night that we were there. And anyway, to make a long story short, I shifted my position just as something broke from the shadows on one side of the road, on the other side of the creek, and went across the little gap to the tree line on the opposite side. So it just glided across that very smooth, compliant gait, and but yet I'm looking with a monocular, so no depth of field, very little ambient light. The moon was extremely low behind the tree line because of we were far north, and as a result, there was no supplemental light and no recording option, unfortunately. That's the age old regret that you didn't have something
yeah, yeah.
set up at the time. Anyway, it was a glimpse, but they were able to. I had to leave before sunup the next day. Sunup comes really quite late, and I had to get back to the airport that day. And so John Bindernagel and Todd cut out the sign, and then not clear footprints. Although he claims to have found additional footprints, John backed him up in the moss where whatever had circled our camp did proceed on through the forest, and under the forest canopy was a very thick layer of moss that footprints were discernible in. But it corresponded to what I saw. When John walks the taped line where they had recreated the path, and Todd stood with the camera up where I had been standing to get a comparable, not exact, but a comparable vantage point. Man, when I saw the image of John, it was like, that's it. That's where it was. Only what I saw was considerably
Yeah.
more massive than John was. And so, which would correlate with the almost 14-inch footprints we'd been finding. So, yeah.
And what about like I to to me I if it makes sense, I'm not sure about the kind of like adaptations and things, but I always heard people say that it was nocturnal, and that to me sort of, I didn't know where I stood on that one, because it's like, are do apes evolve to be nocturnal? Is there a history of that happening, or
Yeah.
is that like a nice excuse for people who can't film it? Like that's what I
No.
thought about in my brain, you know?
Yeah. Well, obviously, I suspect that they do not have the adaptation of a tapetum lucidum any longer, as is the case with all higher primates. Since the lemurs and lorises, the prosimians, do, and many of those are nocturnal, but then the monkeys and apes, the anthropoids, all have a foveate retina with lacking a tapetum lucidum. So I think there's two factors. One is just simply behavioral, and two is anatomic. That is, and you can take the precedent from the order primates. Those two species that have lost the tapetum and have secondarily become nocturnal, the tarsier and the owl monkey of South America, how have they adapted to that strategy? By disproportionately enlarging the eyes, so that the light gathering capacity of the eye is tremendously increased. If Sasquatch, and some researchers have, or some eyewitnesses, I should say, have noted this in their observation, if as they have increased in size, their eyes have isometrically increased in size along with that, then they have a tremendously increased sized eyeball globe for light gathering capacity by comparison to us. So they may not be able to see as well as a dog at night, but they can see much, much better than we can see at night. And so that's one. Now, there is also anecdote. This was really interesting. A friend of mine, Owen Caddy, who went over to Africa to work in the Peace Corps, and then stayed on longer, got a job with as a game warden in Uganda. One of the things they were doing is they were trying to habituate the chimpanzees there to human contact, so they could develop ecotourism, much like, chimps, the Gombe and so forth. Well, one of the challenges they had run into is that the guerrilla warfare, the civil war fighting and so forth, had been so extreme that the chimpanzees had become semi-nocturnal in their habits. They would hunker down during the day to avoid human contact, and they would do most of their foraging late in the evening, and then in the wee hours of the morning. And then once the sun was up, they would take refuge and nest during much of the day. And my question to him was, and they had the hardest time finding and tracking them, but then they started just systematically noting sightings and sign, and they were able to anticipate then where they were going to show up. And sure enough, they set up a blind and were waiting there at night, and sure enough, down the trail, here come the chimpanzees. And I said, well, were they all, one hand on the shoulder in front of them, or did one of them have a white cane that they and he said, no, it was remarkable. They were actually quite adept at getting around just by starlight and moonlight.
Okay.
And I just would add to that, humans have a much greater capacity to get around at night than we currently are used to, because of our reliance on light and the prevalence of light pollution. But if you get out there and get used to the dark, and your eyes are really, not only are your pupils dilated, but you get used to using more of your peripheral vision. Because when we, people, it's always an interesting experiment I have my students do when we're looking at the special senses in the introductory anatomy. When you look at an object, like the most common example, you drop your car keys in the parking lot at night, and you're looking for them, but you can't see anything. Everything is like there's a cloud. Well, that's your fovea, the focal point with the macula that is dominated by cones, which are sensitive to color, but very poorly sensitive to dim light. And then the surrounding peripheral vision is dominated by rods, which aren't as acute in their visual perception, but because there's more convergence of information, and that gives them greater light gathering capacity, amplification kind of through convergence. But the point is, if you think you know where your keys are, instead of looking straight at them to try to reach down and pick them up, if you look just to the side so that the image falls on your peripheral vision, it'll suddenly pop into view much more clearly. And so when we get used to navigating using those cues, we start to see things much more capably than we give ourselves credit for. So
And sorry, just to
yeah,
interrupt, do you think
please.
that they are at a level of intelligence where they can navigate around human? Like, are they actually choosing to avoid human activity? Do you think that they are
Yeah.
that they are, like other maybe apes, would fear human
Yeah,
activity and then retreat back into the forest?
absolutely. Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. And I don't think that requires a high level of intelligence. I mean, there are
Okay.
animals
Yeah.
out there, you talk to hunters who are after that trophy buck year after year after year, and that buck is able to elude the hunters. And so it doesn't take super intelligence. In fact, I think that the higher, I mean, these creatures clearly are on the order of other great apes, if not hominin level, which isn't much more. But I think perhaps that with that greater intelligence comes greater curiosity. And so
Okay.
it's a balance between their natural ability to remain elusive and their curiosity about human activities and smells and sights and so forth. Children playing in the backyard, or the smell of
Oh yeah, of
bacon, or
course. Yeah, I've heard that before.
or there are these great reports, someone going out the side door of their cabin to the woodpile, only to turn and see a Sasquatch standing in the light cast from the picture window, watching what's going on inside the cabin.
Yeah, yeah,
That's their big screen TV, so to speak,
yeah.
where they get their entertainment. Maybe, I don't know, but so I think that's not uncommon at all. So I think there's always a tug of war, give and take
Yeah.
between.
And I do want to
Yeah.
go to footprints, but I just have so much to
Oh,
ask
you're
you
you're
because this
fine.
is
I'm
like,
fine.
yeah.
I'm
Okay,
not
brilliant.
under any
Okay,
deadline, so you
okay,
don't worry about that.
perfect. That's fantastic because I just want to. I have like years of of like what I've watched, what I've gathered. Because to me, I think it's probably it speaks volumes about the human brain if we let a species 8 foot, 9 foot tall go unknown,
Right.
for so long. That would be an incredible achievement, really, to be honest. But um, what do you think about the kind of like their their I heard a report, and I know it sounds fanciful, about a German guy who got kidnapped by one. He had a story
Mhm.
about him being, like one of them kidnapped him and then brought
Yeah.
him to the group and stuff like this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it was. A very interesting story, and again, I was very intrigued about. I didn't just sort of dismiss it,
Right.
but what do you think about their kind of? Are they're obviously very social, but are they like how how aware are they? How much ability do they have in terms
Sure.
of in relation to humans?
Sure. Well, I think that story is a fascinating one. Albert Ostman,
Yeah.
and it came at a time. I mean, it's one of the classics because it came at a time when the level of public knowledge or awareness of the subject of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, was not at all what it is today. I don't want to say that it was unknown, because it was one of those kind of unspoken things that was part of the landscape to local people oftentimes, but without drawing attention to it because it was unusual, it was extraordinary. But I think his account, I became friends with Darius Swindler, as a very well-known, reputationed primate anatomist at the University of Washington, who had the privilege of interviewing Ostman, and
Okay. Yeah.
and yeah, and essentially interrogating him about details of his observation, down to minor details of external genitalia, for example. and
Hmm.
and he came out of that telling Grover Krantz, or I guess maybe it was John Green at the time. It was John Green. Um, if he's making this up, he knows a lot about primate anatomy. He's learned a lot.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So as far as insights into their sociality, my oftentimes that story is taken as indication of a nuclear family.
Yeah.
Mom, ma, pa, and the two
Yeah.
kids. But when you break it down, especially with the backdrop, the context that almost all encounters and all sightings otherwise and footprint finds are of solitary individuals or what are taken to be females with offspring. Then if you look at the Ostman account, there's some interesting insights. First of all, his camp was repeatedly harassed for a number of days, but he was quite removed from the location of Ma and the kids. And so Pa was off doing something different, if that was the case. So let's call him, he's the male, and the female. The male was off doing something different and then carried him, a considerable distance. If a creature that size was going all night long, he could easily have covered, 10, 15, 20, 30 miles. Who knows? And then, and there were also occasions when during his stay in that little box canyon, the male and the female were off doing different things. They would leave the canyon separately, come back with different resources. You talk about one time she comes back with what looks like sweet grass or something, and he comes back with something else. And it suggests to me the possibility that this was a consort pair. He may be the male that had sired those two offspring, but they weren't a unit. They just were periodically together, and maybe he brought this guy back to her to impress her, dinner and a date. Who knows? But I think it's a fascinating story. I have no reason to doubt its veracity.
Yeah. Okay.
Or that of William Rowe that the publication of the first seemed to precipitate. So I think those.
Is there any other because I often think, again, you need to compare it against what are known. Obviously, maybe it has a new behavior that we don't know about that is, it's whatever. But if it has a lot of similarities to other ape behaviors, and that's probably a good indicator. And does that happen anywhere else?
I don't know of any. In the literature for great apes, I don't know of any instances of reported abduction and subsequent escape of humans by apes. There are reports of human infants being stolen by apes and eaten, which provides a precedent for the reports of Sasquatch cannibalistically abducting children and even adults. What seemed like a just so story suddenly becomes very real, potentially very real, when you understand that there was a well-documented and reported upon series of abductions in Uganda. Again, this same friend confided a story with me, which they kind of were instructed to keep, for the time, tamped down, because they were trying to develop ecotourism, and the report of a big chimpanzee stealing a human child and eating it was not good publicity for their efforts. But it became there was such a rash during a 7-month period. There were like 12 abductions of infants and toddlers, and it was during extreme drought conditions, and all the wildlife were struggling, and as well as the people. But suddenly these stories that the Indians were telling about children being snatched and whisked away by Bigfoot, instead of being mere boogeyman stories, they actually have a corollary in the natural behavior of great apes under extreme conditions. So I think, again, it's a fascinating convergence. As far as the abduction like Albert Ostman experienced, I don't know of any offhand.
And do you think that that could maybe be an indication, or that they have maybe a slightly higher sort of social standing than other apes, like chimps or something? That are they would they be more capable of recognizing, oh, this is a human species or something? Like they have those kind of like
Right.
behaviors, or is it just another? It's just a kind of occurrence that is just interesting.
I think since it's hard to make a generalization based on a sample of one, an incident of
Yeah,
one.
of course.
As you were asking that, though, a couple other things did come to mind. For example, there was over in one of the zoos in England, the case of the kid who fell over the wall into the moat, and at least the not the most recent one where they ended up dispatching the gorilla, unfortunately, because he got really rough. But there was one where the female gorilla came to the kid's aid. This female gorilla had spent time in a nursery. She had been separated from her mother because the mother was not tending to her properly, and so she had developed bonds with humans, and as a result, perhaps she cuddled this human and warded off the other gorillas that were getting too curious, and made her way over to the exit, which they were very aware of because the keeper comes in and out there, and laid the kid down right there and retreated back as soon as the humans appeared. I mean, that's quite a cognizant set of behaviors. So I think they're quite capable. I think most animals are, Lassie and Timmy falling in the well. I think we underestimate the capabilities of animals to not only recognize but also to even communicate to us situations or concern or anxiety or whatever. And so again, I don't see, I mean, there's a lot of space between a chimp's IQ and a human's IQ that a Sasquatch could fall into. I'm not going to say, oh, well, they're just great apes on their hind legs. There's potential for more sophisticated, but nothing extraordinary. I mean, we still don't see fire control, we don't see clothing, we don't see tool use, we don't see home bases, we don't, all those things. They seem to be existing in nature in many ways, very similar to the apes. Dr. Bindernagel's first book is great, and he was very groundbreaking. He got his book out several years before I got mine out, but his thesis was North America's great ape, the Sasquatch. And as a non-primatologist, did an excellent job of navigating the great ape behavioral literature and drew these remarkable parallels showing that not only the anatomies but the behaviors of these creatures, as reported by otherwise uninformed, unaware witnesses, converged or were within the range of reported variability for the great apes in astoundingly consistent ways. And so this is it differs in its bipedalism. It kind of, do you call the glass half full or half empty? We place so much import on the advent of bipedalism as a purely, strictly hominin characteristic. And as we started off, since this attitude of us being the one and only living hominin, the acknowledgement that there could be another bipedal primate, which is ergo a hominin, was just unsettling for some people, or unacceptable for some people, given their more antiquated notions of evolution.
And do you subscribe, or you still believe that this is in fact some sort of like either Gigantopithecus, or that it is some sort of like break off, and that they crossed over from Asia, the land bridge through into the USA?
Yeah, I think that there are two null hypotheses worthy of consideration, and the original was Gigantopithecus, because you've got something that's the right size, the right place, the right time. We don't know we have a very limited understanding of Gigantopithecus based on a couple of jaws and isolated teeth. We have no postcranial skeletal remains to know. But once you come to the ground, once you're committed to the ground, as Gigantopithecus would be by its tremendous size, there's only two options. You either go on all fours or you walk on twos. And there are real serious problems of walking on all fours when you've got the shoulder and elbow and wrist of a great ape. And we all experience those to some degree. Like when you do push-ups, there are some people it causes tremendous pain in the wrist, so they have the grips that you can do push-ups from. Or I just go on the backs of my knuckles, and then that keeps the wrist. And that's why the great apes the African apes have adopted this knuckle walking posture to spare their wrists the problems created by palmogrady. Likewise, the shoulders. I mean, our shoulder blades are on the backs of our chests, of our thorax, instead of on the sides where they line up in compression at the shoulder. Joints tolerate compression, they don't tolerate shear very well. And so gorillas and chimps proactively retract their weight, so a much higher proportion is carried by the hind legs than is by the forelegs, which is why they can, stand upright so easily, so readily. So the point is, all those things I just described would be magnified by a 800-pound gorilla to a 1,000-pound gorilla. So it's very, very probable that Gigantopithecus walked on two legs.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you're of the camp that says, well, bipedalism is a strictly hominin adaptation, and so what you see walks remarkably like us, and yada yada, which is really indefensible. But the point is there possible representation amongst the hominins just on the other side of that split? Well, the image that I show that's just it's a set you back on your heels when you look at it. If you take a robust Australopithecine like Paranthropus boisei and take that skull, of which we have much more complete remains as well as postcranials, but you put that up against Patty, who's right there back behind me, point for point, her cranial proportions, the landmarks line up, suggesting that that she exhibits the same remarkable proportions of a very robust Australopithecine, the robusticity being exclusively, essentially, in the facial skeleton, the very deep, flat face, the flaring gonial, the prominent forward jutting zygomatics, the lack of projecting canines to avoid that interlocking gape, and instead have jaws that have a much more express cycle 2 grinding. I've never looked into a Bigfoot's mouth, but I can tell you that the only reason something like Patty would have those facial proportions would be to support megadontia of the premolars and molars, just like in Paranthropus. So, it's interesting because Paranthropus in East Africa, we know, lived until probably, about 800,000 years to 1 million years ago. But that's Africa, and people would say, well, okay, wrong place, wrong time, wrong size. But then they discovered the Hobbit, clear over in Floresiensis, or Flores, and Homo floresiensis. And I was asked to review the Nature article that described the postcranials, and I'm looking at this and going, half of these features look like chimpanzee, let alone Australopithecine. There's nothing human about this at all. The proportions of the feet, the proportions of the toes, the flat flexible foot, all these things, these are Australopithecine. Well, and then finally it was acknowledged that it wasn't a microcephalic dwarf or anything. It had a skull that bore greatest resemblances to Homo habilis. Well, Homo habilis is in East Africa 2 million years ago. So how do you connect those? Dots? Well, if you can connect those dots, you can imagine a robust Australopithecine also surviving and expanding, as did that Australopithecine, into East Africa, and perhaps because it was predisposed with its dental repertoire to gigantism during the Pleistocene, especially as it expanded into more northerly latitudes. That's where megafauna of the Pleistocene principally evolved anyway. And it could be, just as Gigantopithecus also developed those same durophagous adaptations of the jaws and teeth. So, long story short is, yeah, I think there's two possibilities, and either one could well be the answer, and they address the preferences of people of it being on the ape side versus the hominin side. Either one could be a very real possibility.
Okay, but that was fun. I mean, that was really, I love that, because it's like, I think a lot of people who I talk to about it, they think, first of all, they think of it as one Bigfoot walking around the place.
Yeah, a lone monster.
And they don't think of they don't know how, how would an ape get, how does it get there? Like
right.
But yeah, it's a valid question. I'm not, but
well, sure,
my
but
way of,
it's not problematic. You can come back and say, well, look, we have teeth of a red panda, the little raccoon panda bear in Washington State and Alabama. If a little raccoon, which was part of the paleofauna of which Gigantopithecus was a member, if a little raccoon-sized animal made its way into North America, the problem is the problem is so many of these people have this misconception of what the Bering Land Bridge was, because there's been so much emphasis on Pleistocene Beringia as being this periglacial tundra, that they don't know that if you look at the paleo record of that region, the paleogeography, there were periods of contiguous forest from China clear into North America, even southeastern North America, ranging from coniferous forests to mixed deciduous coniferous forests. And so it's not like, as one writer in a book I've got on my shelf there, this journalist who thought he was qualified to write a book about science, he goes, for Bigfoot to have come here from Asia, you have to imagine these shuffling bands of apes braving the cold of an Arctic wasteland as they plod their way into a continent already occupied by hungry humans. I mean, what are you talking about? That's the misconception you're up against. So if you tell them it was forest, it was a temperate forest, and it's not like they pack their bags and say, all right, we're heading east, east or bust. It's just an incremental. This is one of my pet peeves. For example, I got to tell you this one story real quick, because it's such a silly story that gets perpetuated. But oftentimes Homo erectus or African Homo ergaster is characterized as the migratory primate or hominin, the hominin that first forged its way to the extremes of the continent. Well, if you look at the distribution times of Homo ergaster in Africa and the arrival of Homo erectus in East Africa, and you look at the space and prorate the distance, prorate that distance over that time period, no Homo erectus went any further than he could see from his fireplace. In a given generation. That was the incremental rate of expansion of Homo erectus into East Asia. There was, because they used that argument to as a rationale that Homo erectus, with its now long legs, had feet just like us with well-developed arches, so it could march across the Asian steppes, Well, it's just storytelling. It's nothing but just so stories, and it has nothing to do with reality. So, and even one of my very respected colleagues, I mean, he wrote Matt Cartmill from Duke University. I kind of chided him. I took him aside and laid this scenario out for him, because he had a whole chapter on the migratory hominin, about Homo erectus. And I go, what? Why are you perpetuating this concept? And it would be harmless, except that it's used as grist to misinterpret anatomy or make up anatomy that isn't there. There was this diagram of an Australopithecine skeleton and a Homo erectus skeleton, and down at the feet for Homo erectus we have very little by way of skeletal remains, just a couple of isolated metatarsals, but and it was indicated with a dotted line showing that it was absent, and yet it was labeled as having a well-developed arch. How do you justify that? Anyway, okay. I got that off my chest.
No, that's great. It's fascinating. I have like, I don't know how long I've had these questions that I want to ask, because it's a difficult thing engaging in a topic that's so taboo, because you feel, obviously, because it's so against the norm, you feel kind of maybe a bit weird or a bit odd, or you have some sort of flawed thinking. But
yeah.
I can't. The main question that I come back to, and this is why I think your work is so fantastic, is that speculation on videos or whatever. But if this is a hoax, so if it's all just people fabricating information, how do you explain the what is the story behind the footprints that how can you possibly explain that? And I just want to ask you, what, if there's two, you have a theory. So if theory one is it's a real creature and it's leaving these footprints, what is the other theory? What are the statistical odds of it being possible to fake the stuff that you have researched, that in the areas that you found them?
Well, exactly. That's just it. I mean, one of the retorts, the rhetorical statements has often been, or questions has been, who's passing out the little black book with instructions on how to fake a footprint consistently with Dr. Meldrum's model, because this model is based on examples that span decades and expand across continents. So not only is it the basis for the Sasquatch foot, and it's represented in the presence of mid-tarsal pressure ridges, in half tracks when they're running and they're up on the forefoot, in pathologies like the Bosberg cripple foot that shows that illustrates those foot proportions exactly in accordance with the model. But also then you go across the Pacific to China, and here's an example that comes to light that shows a mid-tarsal pressure ridge almost identical. The footprint, it only differs in about a ½ inch of greater breadth from those taken from the Patterson-Gimlin film, cast by someone who hadn't a clue about Sasquatch in North America, in the United States. And at some point it becomes just ridiculous to advocate. I mean, and it's so transparent, because there was an attempt to explain it that way when the Wallaces, Ray Wallace, passed away, and the Wallaces produced these ridiculous looking carved feet and assert that these were used by the Wallace clan to tromp out all the footprints that have ever been found in the Western United States. And they are so transparently, obviously hoaxed, carved wooden planks that don't produce anything even remotely similar to the dynamic and animated footprints that I've examined. That's a telling vindication, condemnation of the hypothesis that they're hoaxed, and vindication of the hypothesis that these are real, animate, legitimate footprints. So it's like I said, there's an undercurrent. There are things going on behind the scenes. I won't give you his name, but just had an email exchange with a colleague from Britain who made some very nice statements, nice comments to me about the work that I have done. He is an expert in foot form and function, well published, well positioned, well reputation, and he's quite willing. He wants to collaborate. He's willing to collaborate, doing some statistical analysis of the things, but of the footprints, the 3D scans using the database that I'm accumulating. But his comment I thought was very interesting. He said how impressed he was by the remarkable consistency that I have done so much to convey and to demonstrate, to a deaf audience. Essentially, he acknowledges that, but nevertheless, he is very impressed, and his students as well. One of his students has been very intrigued by the possibility of doing some work on the footprint virtual archive that I'm creating. So, yeah, it's, if anyone will take the time and consider, you can't just write these off as a bunch of hoaxes. I mean, you can't.
Yeah. That's for me, that's like, I have a good mind for like looking at things and seeing where things don't make sense. And again, I'm not really, I'm obviously invested in the topic in terms of like, I have a huge interest in it, but my life doesn't depend on whether this thing is real or not. I'm not like,
well, right.
Yeah, it's not that I want to do it because I want some sort of an interest. I need it to be real. I don't need it to be real. I just keep seeing these trends that are with the data that suggests like there's something here that cannot be just explained by just, oh, that's all just a load of nonsense, that's all just a load of hoaxing. And like, can you successfully fake the kind of dermal ridges and the mid-tarsal break, like that amount of weight that would need to go in to produce that type of footprint? Is it possible with like, to do it?
Well, some have claimed that it is. There have been a couple of attempts by now his name slipped my mind, but they were featured also in David Daeglin's book. Dr. Daeglin is an anthropologist at the University of Florida State University, and he's takes a very skeptical approach to the whole thing, and to the point of blinding himself to the incoherence of some of his arguments. But they try. Unfortunately, what they've done is equated the displacement disc from behind the metatarsal heads, for example, and amateur investigators often do that when they're looking at a human footprint that is in the mud or in sand, and it's kicked back quite a pressure release, but it's always right from behind the metatarsal heads at the fore part of the arch. It doesn't equate to the mid tarsus in any way, shape, or form in those instances. So there are those. There are the only way but those examples that are used, proffered as counter evidence, are always done in loose sand, moist sand, where it's easy to make a displacement. But when you get the examples in wet compacted sand or in soil and mud, it's a different thing altogether. If you go in and try to individually sculpt the footprint, we had one fellow who thought by adding a mid-tarsal pressure ridge, he would increase the credibility of the more questionable footprint that had a very vague outline, and so he had tried to physically create the displacement. I mean, the signs of which were very obvious, and he'd put it in the wrong place. It was way too far forward for it to be anatomically correct. So I don't think it's straightforward to try to introduce those kinds of things in artificially, and no, I don't think that they could be mistaken for other features. I'm missing you. There was part of your question at the fore there that I missed a little.
Well, I just
addressed.
basically, it's basically like, what can you put forward, like playing to to just completely switch the perspective and say, like, if you were someone who not, I kind of think that sometimes that the person who's claiming to be skeptical is actually already decided that it's not real.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
sometimes don't think that they're being honestly objective.
right.
And but if you were to, like, what is the scenario? What is, if someone says to you, here is a scenario in which this animal is not real, but all these footprints exist. Like,
Oh,
what is that? Can you even conceive of like, where is the thought there? Like, what is the opposition
right.
side to the footprints?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that the people who have taken the academics who have been most inclined to be open-minded, like Grover Krantz, John Napier, it was the footprints that was the most telling body of data that that tipped the scale. And there's some other exceptions. I mean, Dr. Bindernagel was an ecologist, so he had a broader perspective, and Officer Jimmy Chilcutt was a latent fingerprint examiner, so it was the dermatoglyphics that was the real driving. I mean, obviously, each of us is going to be most impressed by that data that requires the kinds of expertise that we have to evaluate it. I gave a presentation at a university, an invited presentation, and the department chair of the faculty member who invited me asked a question at the university-wide presentation. I did a class one, class discussion, and then they did a university one. But anyway, he asked a question, and of course, his question, he was a forensic archaeologist, and his question was about the remains and the physical trace of their activity, their sociality. And I gave him an apologist's answer nonetheless, but a reasonable explanation for why physical remains are so rare and so unlikely to be encountered. And then later that evening at dinner, I had the opportunity. I asked him, I said, was that answer? I said, I mean, I acknowledge it's an apologetic answer, but was that at all satisfying? And he said, well, no, not really. And I go, well, I find it curious that people, from coming at it from your perspective of skepticism, you have your pet missing piece of data that seems to eclipse everything else, all of the other information. And he goes, well, what other evidence are you talking about? And I felt like, weren't you at my talk? I presented, and I said, well, for me, first and foremost, the footprint evidence makes the most persuasive case. His response was interesting. He said, oh, I'm not an expert in footprints. And I said, well, I am, as a matter of fact. And don't you think that therefore my opinion deserves the same deference that you might expect from me when it came to a question of forensic archaeology? And that changed. I mean, I couldn't believe it, but that changed the tone of the conversation from there out. How could a person of his accomplishment and his station not acknowledge the bias, the inherent bias of his own prejudice? It's but that's so often the case. I mean, and that's why I don't make any qualms when I speak publicly and do presentations and so forth. In my book, I pulled all the stops on chapter 13, which was on footprints. And while editors and colleagues were saying, when it came to other chapters, well, they were helping to gauge the level of technicality. When it came to that, I says, they'd say, oh, the people aren't going to understand. What are you talking, mid-tarsal break? And I said, no, I'm not changing it. The meat and potatoes has got to be here so that they have a reference to go to. Which
I had the audio book of I had the Audible version, and I listened to that, but I'm going to get the physical copy and have a proper read, because it's like, just listening to it, it was just like, piece of evidence after piece of evidence after piece of evidence after, and then you talk about sightings, you talk about people's own sort of anecdotal things, then you talk again about the evidence that's been found, and it's just almost like I find it tiring that it's not even remotely sort of you know just even engaged with, on any level whatsoever. And do you have any sense or any kind of, do you think that we are in any way close to a time where something will happen, where some sort of evidence will be so
I do. Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do. I would add before I answer that, though, that the other advantage to actually having the physical book is I'm a very visual learner and teacher, and there's like 150 figures that
That's what I
unfortunately,
missed. Yeah.
the audio. And so I'm glad that the audiobook is out there and it reaches that extended audience, but I'm also disappointed because those people are missing out on so much data.
That's why I'm gonna get the book, because I agree. Like, not being able to actually see it really did lower the kind of ability to just be like, oh, okay, yeah, there you go.
Sure. Now you have to refresh me. Your last question. I thought I was going to be able to hold on.
It was just,
and it's
no, that's okay. So just do you think that we're approaching,
breakthroughs? Breakthroughs.
Yeah.
I think there's two lines of potential evidence or investigation that may produce the evidence that's needed to kind of push it up over, short of the serendipitous discovery of physical evidence, be that a spelunker comes out of a cave with a giant mandible, or a trucker in a semi hits one on the highway and reports it. And those two lines of evidence are environmental DNA, eDNA, which will allow us to cast the net more broadly, but it's not a silver bullet, because there still are potential challenges that I anticipate to identifying a unique sequence attributable to Sasquatch for a couple of reasons. It's going to take an exhaustive, systematic characterization, which includes, in fact, focuses on the nuclear DNA. If you're not already familiar, another good source of information, in addition to my book, I mentioned earlier this online journal, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, and there's an article, a recent article in there, and I can send you a link to it right away. So
please do.
On mitochondrial introgression, where the author does an excellent job of positing a possible scenario whereby limited successful hybridization introduces human mitochondrial genes into the Sasquatch population, which through the lucky lineage principle become the dominant, in which case they would still be, the phenotypic expression of the nuclear hybrid dilutes with the back crossing into the population, but the human mitochondrial genome is maintained. And if we do preliminary tests, as is often the case on alleged samples, by just looking at one or two parts of nuclear genes, some markers, we may be looking at mitochondrial genes. We may be looking at essentially human. And that's what invariably comes back when any hair sample, for example, successfully yields DNA. It comes back as human. And the explanation is, well, it's just misidentified human hair, or two, it's been contaminated through mishandling by the amateur investigators, or three, I've argued, we haven't sequenced enough to pick up that maybe 0.5% difference between us and them, if they're more closely related to us than chimps. But now there's a fourth possibility, that perhaps there is mitochondrial introgression, and we are looking at human mitochondrial genes, and we need to look at the nuclear genes. So that's a real important consideration. I think the acknowledgement of that, but unfortunately, to do that kind of study, that's probably a multi-year study with lots of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you have to have someone, even if you have the money and you have the technology, you have to have the people who are willing to devote that part of their career because
of
it's
course.
such a cutthroat environment out there of publish or perish, and grant renewals depend on that productivity. If you're perceived as being risky, and you have a gap in your publication record because you have trouble getting this data published. So that's one. The second one, though, is advancements in aerial survey and thermal and LiDAR visualizations. As more advanced thermal becomes available to the public with greater penetrance through the canopy, we'll have a much better way to survey. And then also, I've talked with some LiDAR techs and proposed this possibility. Can you, in addition to picking out Mayan temples, can you see individual large mammals on the order of 500 to 1,000 pounds? And they say, well, not yet, but we're close. He says, give it a couple of years and we could probably, find your Bigfoot for you with LiDAR scanning.
Wow.
So I think those are the two directions, because the boots on the ground, camera traps, and call blasting and tree knocking, those might produce the fleeting encounter now and again, the glimpse or the furry profile of some amorphous shape in a trail camera image. But I don't think it's going to be dumb luck if we make any breakthroughs in that way. So I think these other two. So my next big project, which I'm trying to cultivate some potential funding for, I've got a collaborator who does the eDNA sequencing study, that aspect of it. His name's Neil Gemmell. He's in New Zealand. He led the international team that did the Loch Ness study, where they sampled the Loch Ness waters and concluded there was some unknown giant, well, potentially giant, some unknown eel species present in the loch. And I bumped into one of his graduate students, and in the course of the conversation, he put me in touch with his advisor, and turns out he's interested. But it's going to be, when I asked him what the budget would be, it's like, it was quite a bit. But if he does it, he wants to do it right, has to have a postdoc and a graduate student, and it'll be a 2 to 3 year project. And so it's a several $100,000 project. So I've got to get my benefactors lined up.
But my last question. This has been absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for. It's just been great to be able to talk to you, because the subject is something is dear to me, and I have a great fascination. I will continue to have a fascination with it.
Sure.
But my last question is more of a kind of personal one for you, and is if, or hopefully when, there is that kind of breakthrough moment.
Excuse me.
What are you going to be doing? What do you think? Where will you be? Will you be out just saying, I told everyone?
Well,
how do you think it will go?
I hope I'm magnanimous enough to take the high road. There are a couple of individuals who I definitely will invite to a personal serving up of crow with liberal dispersal. But no, I mean, it'll be extremely gratifying, of course. It'll be my hope would be, and this is what galls me. I mean, as scientists, it's imperative, just as I pointed out with the first example, where it's imperative that we consider things against a historic backdrop. And if you have an appreciation of the history of discovery within zoology, you should recognize that what we are witnessing is the textbook model of the unveiling, the discovery of a novel species. If you go back to the narratives of gorillas and the discussions and arguments about the pros and cons of these reports of these man-like hairy creatures in Africa, and you just substitute Sasquatch, you have the story almost, you know. I mean, it's the same thing that's happening. Bindernagel in his second book is entitled The Discovery of Sasquatch. I mean, the point is, it's been discovered, it just hasn't been acknowledged. And he goes through the philosophy and history of science and just shows how each of these periods of the history of the unveiling of the unfolding of the evidence have their parallels. And what we see, the type of rejection, the type of bias and prejudice is typical of human reaction to things that are unexpected and previously unknown. So you would think that scientists would be more attuned to that and not fall prey to the implications, the downside of that aspect of human behavior. But it doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, people are I was always very idealistic as a young student, and it was very disappointing, this and other. I always seemed to be attracted to because I mean, the thing that attracted me to science was exploration. It was the spirit of discovery, not sitting at a bench doing the mundane things over and over and over and over. You know, I mean, that has to be done, but that's not what attracted me. And so I was very idealistic, and so it was very disappointing, quite honestly, to see the lack of open-mindedness, the lack of curiosity, the lack of acknowledgement, simply because it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist attitude. So anyway, so I'll be once it's discovered, then the work just begins. So hopefully I'll be able to and be in a position to be capable and healthy enough to jump right in and not get excluded. That's one of the concerns, because one of the professional consequences of this involvement is that my mainstream, if you will, my mainstream research on bipedalism and hominin adaptations has been largely sidelined and doesn't get citation, simply because it's well, why would we cite papers that Meldrum has written if he's also talking about Bigfoot? That would give credibility to his other ideas. I don't know if that's actually what's going on, but I mean, it's so blatant at times how it's very political. A certain narrative is pushed by a certain ideological camp, and you suppress any other contrary voices through lack of acknowledgement, lack of recognition, lack of inclusion, and peripheralization. So we
had it recently with the giant squid. Was a very similar kind of thing, wasn't it? That for a long period of time, it was kind of laughed at and sort of said, oh, like, this animal couldn't exist, it's not possible, even though people have been seeing it for hundreds of years,
right?
And then all of a sudden one just happens to be found, and then it's like chalked off. It's like, oh well, let's forget about that whole event. Now it's a real animal, let's move forward.
No, I know. It's such a short memory memory span, or myopic vision of history. It's so I'll be happy. That's every time someone ever accuses me of being competitive, of being critical of someone because I don't want them to get attention, I say to them, you're crazy. That just shows you're describing yourself. I'll be doing back handsprings. If you prove Sasquatch exists tomorrow, I'll be doing back handsprings, because everything that I've been doing for the last 29 years is now vindicated. You've been doing this for 5 years or whatever. Put in the hard knocks. I'm the one that has stuck to it and has kept the door ajar and keeps pushing the evidence in front of the altar of science.
Well, the thing you can only hope, because I think whenever that revolutionary or wherever that piece of evidence hits, it's going to be up there with the biggest thing, I think, in the history of science.
I would think so.
So you're on the right path in terms of,
yeah. I mean, just by
yeah.
the nature of the fact that, again, we are egocentric, and so
Yeah.
a discovery of such proximity to our own identity would have tremendous impact. You're right. I think it would, very much so. So it's I've had people of various religious persuasion who accost me and say, why are you trying to prove this? What will the implications be for religion? You're just trying to promote evolution and atheism. And I go, I said, does the existence of a gorilla threaten your faith, your personal faith? Well, no. I said, well, that's all this is going to be. It's just another gorilla that happens to walk on its hind legs. I said, there's really, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can anticipate, there's no other implication. I could be wrong on that point, but it makes the point to them when they suddenly look at it like that. Well, yeah, I know. I mean, initially the prospect of a gorilla was threatening to Christian faith in 19th century Europe, but it quickly fell by the wayside, and it's just, oh yeah, it's just another animal. It just kind of looks more like us than anyway.
Yeah, no,
that's been interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I wish you all the best, and I hope that breakthrough moment happens very, very soon. It doesn't have to. Yeah. You don't have to wait too much longer.
I hope so too. That would be great. That'd be great. Great Christmas present this year.
Fantastic. Yeah.
All right. Well, I will. I'll get that.
If you want to just click stop recording, maybe just there. So.
Yeah. Let's see here. I always have to. I do this for one of my classes, but I don't. Reaction. There we go. Pause. Stop recording.